that, the king of Assyria is instituted and backed by the gods at Ashur. By participating in this system, even though it's not in your own best interest, you're working towards the greater good. In Liverani's article, he really breaks this down into 4 component parts. He tries to kind of come up with a grammar of Assyrian ideology. And of course that's played out right in these texts, in the imagery that goes all the way from these monumental reliefs to the actual objects that the kings would have on their bodies. He looks at it in terms of space, right? This use of space, ordered space in the interior, surrounded by, right, a chaotic periphery. He looks at time, right? The establishment of traditions, the establishment of palaces which are intended to last forever and ever, bringing and instituting that order. He looks at the diversity of men, Assyrians, right, who are ordered, who know that process by which, right, you make civilization, versus all of these people on the periphery who are essentially barbarians speaking strange languages. And finally, right, a diversity of goods. Right, the Assyrian heartland is about creating fine goods like those that we saw in the tombs at Nimrud, where the periphery serves really just to sort of, provide the resources for the construction of those goods. So Liverani's point essentially is that what you've got is a restructuring of reality in which, instead of the reality which is you've got Assyria surrounded by a vast network of different traditions, different peoples, different languages, landscapes that are varied from swamps to mountains. Really what this ideology does is creates really a false dichotomy. Becomes Assyria versus, right, the rest of the world. So instead of Assyria just being one facet in this big mosaic of cultures in the ancient Near East, now there's only Assyria and then everybody else. And really this, Liverani calls it this ideology of imbalance. It makes things much less complex. It makes it possible to narrow it down to a binary opposition and really take possession of manpower, of goods, in the name of creating organization and bringing things into the center. Now that said, we've seen elements of this before, right? We've seen imperial ideology act out in Egypt. And we've seen also in Egypt that often, the way that things are displayed at home through propaganda, through massive artworks and whatnot, are very different than the way that things play out actually in the field. And a great way of kind of looking at this is during the reign of Shalmaneser III. Shalmaneser III is the successor of Ashurnasirpal II. And he really picks up where Ashurnasirpal leaves off. He continues these annual campaigns that were inaugurated by his father, where every season you would actually go out on military campaign, attacking primarily cities to the south and to the west. Remember our geography. The mountains keep the north and the far east, right, with the Zagros and Taurus mountains. They make campaigning very difficult. So primarily Shalmaneser's directions for expansion are focused on the west and also to a certain extent on the south. But we'll see how in the south it's a bit different, and the way that these is focused again to the west and then to the south, as he says, right, conquering Assyria from the North Sea to the Southern Sea, right, our Mediterranean all the way to the Persian Gulf. We'll see how that ideology is actually a bit more complicated. We get into this question of are his motives, just conquest, or is it to establish actual networks of trade? So we have texts from the reign of Shalmaneser III, these annual texts in which he accounts for his expansion. Moving to the west, he comes in contact with the cities of Damascus, Hama, the kingdom of Israel, and ends up fighting a coalition of these forces. It seems that he's fairly successful. Again, an Assyrian king, he's never going to say that he loses. He says he kills over 20,000 troops in these battles, bringing this entire region under his control. However, it seems as though this is a little bit less of a total victory, as in later campaigns, these kings rise again constantly over and over, and each year he has to go and put them down again. Eventually, he sort of allows them to exist autonomously, but at the expense of paying heavy tribute, sending again those goods to the Assyrian capital at Nimrud. And indeed, during the time of Shalmaneser, a lot of his monuments really seem to place emphasis on establishing long-term trade relations as opposed to simply extracting booty. We see these motivations, right, to get stone, to get timber, to get metals, and also people, right, because labor is a big part of this system. In fact, we read that that many times Shalmaneser would actually uproot entire cities and populations and move them, right? For example, these Aramaeans suffer terribly in the sense that they're uprooted from their cities and then moved to other parts of the empire. Why would you do that? In addition to needing labor to build these palaces at Nimrud, why would you be moving populations around? Yeah.
Well, it risk themselves, the people that they moved, they won't fight back, and it makes other people wary of fighting back because they don't want to move.
Exactly. Yeah. Two sets, right? One, it destroys the power base within these communities, and two, it sends a message to other communities that this is the price that you pay. And we've seen that the price is a very, very heavy one for those who actually end up resisting. In fact, we know that about 193,000 people, the majority of them being Aramaeans, like those at the city of Tel Halaf, were moved and displaced during the reign of Shalmaneser III. Shalmaneser doesn't leave Nimrud. He's tied into this system, this Assyrian system, and so the capital stays the same. He stays at Nimrud. He ends up building there. We'll take a look at some of his building complexes. But we do have a continuation of the same program of art and propaganda during the reign of Shalmaneser that we saw in Ashur-nasirpal. One of the best examples we have is, it comes from the site of Baluat. And Baluat is a military encampment about 16 kilometers northeast of Nimrud, and it has at least one temple in it. And it was here that 3 separate sets of bronze bands, these bronze bands that would have been used to hold together temple doors, were found. 2 of them date to the reign of Ashur-nasirpal, 1 dates to the reign of Shalmaneser, and that's actually the best preserved one. Has anybody been to the British Museum by chance? Any of you? No? If you do get the chance to go, you'll see a tremendous, again, Layard, right, was excavating, and a lot of this material ended up at the British Museum. You can see this reconstruction of the Baluat gates using the bands of bronze themselves. And those of you who remember, these bands of bronze from the doors are actually mentioned in the banquet stele that we read, I think, what was it, last week? The banquet stele of Ashur-nasirpal. He talks about creating these doors and adorning them with bands of bronze. Each door had 8 bronze bands, and again, these bands were about 27 centimeters high and consisted of 2 registers, as you can see here. And what was great is the doors themselves, while the wood, of course, had deteriorated and the bands were found, the circumference of each band allowed excavators to reconstruct the gate and also reconstruct its height. The gate was probably about 20 feet high and 7 feet wide. And of course, richly ornamented with the same sorts of images that we would see on the palaces at Nimrud, the same sorts of Assyrian iconography. No one's ever answered the question. I was always curious as to, if you have these 20 feet up, right, these bands which are just wonderfully, wonderfully ornamented, who's going to see these? So again, these probably fill not just a propaganda purpose, right? Because remember, people are spending a lot of time at the gates, right? When they're being interrogated by Assyrian guards and they're standing there and answering questions. Oh, who are you? Why are you here? They're going to be seeing these images, but right, they wouldn't be seeing images up at the very, very top. So they also serve, right, as probably symbolic protection for these temples, for these palaces, as well. Because again, these are points of transition, right? The entrance and exit to a temple or to a palace. And these ones come from a temple. Let's take a look at some of the images on these Balawat gates. Again, right, we compare them to the reliefs from the throne room of Ashurnasirpal II. We see the same images of Assyrian conquest. Those images that Liverani again says points to a duality of Assyria versus the rest of the world, a center and a periphery. We see that a tremendous amount of work went into the construction of these bands. Many times, different artists worked on the same band. You can see it in the style of the art, and these were created using indentations from the back. So they were the figures were sort of indented from the back and then incised on the front. So a very technical and precise method of manufacture, similar to what we saw with those gold vessels from Nimrud itself, right? These indented figures from the back, so they raise up and are quite striking. So we see scenes of conquest. We see scenes of tribute being brought to the Assyrian heartland, images of material being brought by boat, possibly even Cyprus at this time as well. Cyprus is mentioned. Cyprus actually becomes a bit more important later on, but you can see these scenes of tribute being brought forward. And in addition, I should point out too, inscriptions that make this clear. So here we have an inscription running along the top, talking in terms of this being tribute being brought from the Phoenicians along the Mediterranean coast. What's interesting too is that these gates, when we think about what they're made out of, right? They're made out of cedars, so cedar trees, which have to be brought in from Lebanon. They're made of bronze, right? Metals that have to be brought primarily from the north. So in a lot of ways, the gates themselves, by what they are made out of, also send a message of, empire, of the ability to bring these resources back, much like the Stele of Naram Sin, right, which was actually made out of material from the conquered areas, right? That pink sandstone that was from the area of the Lulubis. In the same sense, right, this gate is actually constructed from the areas that it itself depicts being conquered.